Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 263. I'm delighted to welcome onto the podcast today, Olivia Greenhalgh. Olivia, how are we doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I've probably said this on too many podcasts, but we just had a chat there that we said we should have recorded. We just missed out on loads of great information that the listeners would have probably benefited from. So now we have to replicate that and go one step further on the podcast. So no pressure.
No pressure at all. I'll try and remember what we said.
Olivia, kick us off. As we always do on the podcast, I want to hear about you, your background, your career, what you're doing at the moment.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So education-wise, my first degree was in sports technology engineering, if you can get it out. So that was a heavily male industry that was quite niche in terms of we sat on a lot of the engineering courses at uni, but we also were involved in the sports and biomechanics. So it was a real nice combination of the two. After that, I then went working in sports services for a short period of time. So that was looking at the construction of artificial pitches, which was really interesting because playing football myself and having played on many 3G pitches, I then began to understand a little bit more about what actually goes into it and the FIFA regulations for them. So that was a short spell out of uni, and then I went to be a research assistant at the University of Central Lancashire. So that was working closely with Professor Jim Richards, he's professor of biomechanics, and we kind of took any product in from Lancashire that interacted with the body. So it could be anything from an office chair, looking at posture, to blister socks, seeing how the grip worked within that. And yeah, we had a real range and diverse product range that came into that lab, and we would kind of grill it in any sort of way possible. And the idea behind that was really to create an evidence base behind a lot of products that are now coming to market, and sort of encouraging that evidence-based purchasing and evidence-based decision making. So there I really began to learn a lot about using different equipment and looking at different methods of analysis in the lab. So it's a great foundation to then move into a knowledge transfer partnership, which was working with a company called Swellaway that I'm at currently, and two universities, UCLan and Manchester Met. So we had a massive range of academics within that. It was a great resource of a knowledge transfer partnership. I'm not sure if you're aware of them, but they're like an Innovate UK grant. So a company and an academic partner would bid for a pot of money to then hire an associate, who then becomes sort of the middleman in between creating the evidence for a product or a service, but then the academics also get things like publications. So it's a nice marriage between the two, where the company can really accelerate at a pace with the support of the university. So it's a great scheme, and I was on that project for just over 3 years. And then following that, I then moved across the company. So my project at the KCP was to develop an evidence base behind a new cooling, heating and compression device. So that's marketed in the elite sport market. So it's very new in terms of the approach. You can control time, temperature and compression, which is quite a novel approach to using ice as such that's used out there. So yeah, moving on from there, then I've come across the companies, carry on with the research and development of that product.
And the best thing about this podcast today is that you can put two caps on, because we're going to talk about all the professional, well, I say it's both professional, but the professional side in terms of all your research and all the great work that you're doing, which we're going to dive into in a second. But also, you briefly mentioned it there, your playing side as well. So give us a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, so I've played football since the age of 5. So it came out of the blue. Mum and sister, not a fan of football, so I'm not really sure where it came from. But yeah, die hard football since being very young. I played with just like local boys teams for a long time, just friends from school. I think I liked the rough and tumble of it, if I'm honest. I think I'd knock them down and then pick them back up and say sorry. But yeah, so there I really began to learn the physicality of the game, playing in the boys' side. and then at the age of 12 at the time, I had to leave. So I think that was the rule back then. I believe it's now been increased maybe to 16 or a bit higher. But at 12, I had to leave and go and find a girls' team, which I was mortified at because that's all I knew, was playing with my friends. But I then moved to a great setup locally called Academy Juniors, which was like a local girls' team that's just started in the area, because back then there wasn't many options in terms of to girls' academies. I then went in between there and Blackburn Rovers a bit. So Blackburn was a centre of excellence. There wasn't really much around other than Blackburn in terms of that at that stage. And then as I was getting older, just before university, I went to play women's football for FC United of Manchester. And yeah, again, great experience, kind of going from academy football to women's sport again. So learning sort of back to the roots of playing with the men, the physical game of the women's game. So yeah, and then went to university and was lucky enough to play with some brilliant people at Sheffield Hallam University. So played with the likes of Amy Turner, who's now at Tottenham, Jess Sigsworth, who was at Man United, now at Sheffield United. So we had a brilliant team, and we absolutely flew through the leagues. I think we got to the top league just as I left. So yeah, that was a great time at uni. And then coming back from uni, I then went back to FC United, and then went to Burnley. So I was at Burnley for 5 years. COVID kind of blends the years a bit, doesn't it? But I think it was fine. And then this season I've now joined Stockport County. So I've been playing between tiers 3 and 4 of the women's game, which is the National League. And I've really seen it develop from where I was in the little boys team back in Bolton to Stockport County now. So it's been a great journey.
It's obviously something we were talking about before we came on the podcast, like the women's game as a whole and sort of progression, and
yeah,
I suppose the exciting times in terms of how far it's already come, but also the next few years as well, isn't it? It's a really, really key time.
Oh, definitely. It's going in the right direction. I mean, even during my football career, I've seen it progress so much, and I wish I was coming into the game right now, because for me, I never saw it as a career. It was always a hobby, and I was almost forcing, no matter what I wanted to do, I knew I wanted to do it in sport and football. So I was almost looking outside of actually playing, of how can I still stay in the game to have a career. Hence why I think I was tearing my mum's hair out during university time, picking what to do. I was trying to find a sport related topic that I could really stay in sport without actually playing. But looking at the girls now, the younger teammates, I'm almost jealous of them, thinking, you've got such a long way to go now, because the game is really improving. Still a long way to go, but it's definitely on the up, and that's all we can ask for.
Brilliant. I'm going to get you to give a player perspective in a little bit, and dive into that, because that'll be really interesting, I think, for the listeners. But we're going to start on a topic that's probably, there's a lot of different views around this in terms of the use of ice around injury management. So it'd be great to ask you the question, put the question to you. Do we ice? Yeah. Do we not ice? What do we know about this area?
Yeah, so I completed my PhD during the KTP. So that was around using the novel cooling device for knee injury management. So looking through the guidelines of what's been previously, ice and compression are still in the guidelines for acute injury management, but it's sort of an area that there's just not enough research on, and such a massive gap in knowledge. Obviously, in recent times, there's been the development from RICE, which started probably when we, back in school, everybody knows rest, ice, compression, elevation. We've now gone to PRICE and then PLEACE, and now there's a new Peace and Love acronym that's floated around. So that's where Peace and Love was the first time that ice has been removed out of the acronym. It's not an official guideline yet, but it's been posted sort of as an editorial blog, and it's got a lot of people talking of, do we ice or do we not ice? So the rationale why they've took it out, they say there's not enough evidence or high quality evidence on the efficacy of using ice to promote healing. So the actual efficacy for injury, they're not sure there's enough to support it yet. But what they do say is that there's plenty of evidence to support it as an analgesic effect. So just for that pain relief, without having to take paracetamol or painkillers, it's got really strong evidence for being a short-term pain relief. So there's kind of two sides to the argument. But what I like about the whole argument is that it actually gets people thinking of, well, why are we using ice? So I know it's been stood the test of time, and even the ancient Greeks used ice. So it's common for people to not even think and just chuck ice on it. So I really like that this has now opened the conversation of, well, when and where is the best time to use it? Because it's definitely got a place, but why are we using it, and what's the clinical rationale for using it during that time, rather than just kind of chucking a player a bag of ice and saying, crack on. So I think it opens up a really good debate, but I know it is quite a controversial topic out there, and I don't think there's a clear answer either way, but I do think there's definitely a place for it, and I just think you have to be conscious of the effects that it has. So I know in the Peace and Love acronym, they talk about disrupting the natural healing process. So it's sort of, are we starting that inflammation process again? Because we do have to go through the healing process. And what they're saying is it actually pausing it, delaying it? Is it interrupting what the body is really good at and fighting itself? But for that pain relief sensation, I think, it's such an easy and cheap win to actually to reduce that pain, which is it's predominantly that's its main aim. So yeah, you could get me talking on this all day.
in terms of that though, so what are they suggesting is the alternative? So removing ice out, or what is the alternative?
They've not suggested an alternative, so it has got quite a bit of backlash, I would say, in terms of the way the acronym has been presented. So I still think there'll be tweaks to it, even if that came to light in clinical guidelines. They do suggest as well avoiding anti-inflammatories for 24 to 48 hours. But yeah, like you say, if someone's in a lot of pain, they're not just going to kind of sit there and suffer to let the body fight itself. So it is a difficult one. But yeah, a lot of the research that I've done has been around. So the device that I use in the research, which is called Promotion EV1, it's a targeted cooling, heating, and compression device. So it's a lot smaller than some of the other products out in the market that kind of cover a massive area. And what's been presented in the research is that when you do cover a massive area, for example, sort of like mid-thigh to mid-calf, you significantly affect muscle strength and stability. So if a player's kind of come into the physio room, they've whacked, the cooling across the full area, and then they're actually going back into strengthening exercises or the rehab exercises they've been set, they're at a much higher risk of injury than if they were previously. So it's just to be conscious of, when and where you are using cooling. There was a phase a long time ago to kind of have cooling at half time as well. But then obviously players are then going back onto the pitch in detrimental circumstances. So the PhD was kind of to look, does it actually have, even though we are targeting a smaller area, does it have the same pain relief effects, and does it have the same effects on function? And what we're able to find is that actually targeting the exact site of the area, you got the same pain relief. So this is participants with knee injuries and participants with induced pain. That's a long story. They got the same pain relief, but they didn't significantly affect muscle strength or dynamic stability, which is obviously really important. Then they could go back into their rehab exercises and kind of get that load in a little bit earlier than having to do another thorough warm-up. I've gone slightly off topic there, Ben, I'm sorry.
No, not at all. The other area in terms of ice, I know it's different, because if we look at recovery, obviously it's an area that it's used a lot, isn't it? And especially with the use of ice baths recently, it seems to be the real trend at the moment for players. You have to do it at 4 o'clock in the morning. You have to sit in your own garden by the looks of it. But these products, there's a hell of a lot out there now, isn't there? And the trend seems to be increasing. So where does this apply to more of the recovery side, do you think?
Yeah, so recovery is an interesting one. I know there's a lot of research going into that, which is great, and sort of looking at how it would fit over a football schedule, for example, on match days. But how I see it is, so the ice baths are great, and actually, if the player is perceiving a better recovery, even if the physiological results and research out there are conflicting or questionable, not quite strong enough yet, if the player feels like they're recovering better, then that perception is massive for them going back into training and feeling a little bit more energized. So we did a scoping review on contrast therapy, and it was very much similar to that in terms of there's not a lot of evidence out there for contrast therapy, but you know, how many players will come out and have an ice bath and then a hot bath, and it's such a trend, which is great because, you know, they're doing something to help recovery, but a lot of the results that I found within the research were conflicting in terms of physiological results, but it was undeniable that the actual perception of recovery was increased. So that there's a win there somewhere, even if we're unsure what it's actually doing yet. There's perception benefits that are massive, particularly in sport, and feeling, you know, able to train and feeling better the next day. Then that's great. I know there's been a big push for them on mental health as well recently, which is great. So yeah, there's definitely benefits coming out of them, but it's just a case of the research now. We just need to understand it a bit more of what's actually going on. But with cryotherapy, it's been contrast therapy, it's been a challenge previously to actually measure a lot, other than using like a water immersion. So that's one thing I'm finding with the device, is that because you can control it between hot and cold and the compression, it's opened up a massive opportunity to actually to look at areas like this, because previously we've not been able to, you know, apply contrast therapy on the shoulder, for example, in a very controlled, targeted manner. So it's opened up a massive area that you can actually explore, because there's such a gap in knowledge of it, but it is a massive area, so we're chipping away.
In terms of that size of the unit, because I find that really interesting in terms of you saying like really trying to isolate a part of your body, which makes sense in terms of the risk of injury as well. And also the fact that I think a lot of people are using ice for things like recovery or injury management or whatever, but like you said before, it's just sort of thrown on, and probably not so much not so much time or effort spent in terms of like an actual protocol. It's just, we know we've got to use it in some way, shape or form. But in terms of that unit that you're using, how big are we talking? Like, what's the sort of size?
So it's it's about 7 centimeters by 5 centimeters. So it's a bit bigger than your iPhone, for example, kind of that sort of size. So putting that in a really targeted manner across the body, we can obviously see that throughout the thermal imaging results we've done, it's really controlled on what you're setting temperature wise and what you're achieving skin surface wise. Whereas obviously a lot of products are kind of coming water-based, which is a lot more difficult to control, particularly on the skin. But what we're finding as well is quite interesting in terms of, because you are cooling a smaller area, your brain doesn't perceive that your skin's as cold as if you were covering a bigger area, obviously affecting a lot less nerves. So especially with the trend of ice baths at the moment, kind of getting that thermal shock as such when you first get in, it's actually a lot more comfortable when you're putting it on the body, which means you can actually do, you know, a few more sessions without feeling like you're torturing yourself. But on the flip side of that, some players like that shock feeling of something, it's doing something. So you do get a few different personalities with it, which is why contrast therapy is often quite popular with the players we work with, because something's constantly changing every 3-4 minutes. The compression's changing or the temperature's changing. So it's a bit of that perception of that it's something's happening, so something must be working sort of thing. Even though when we've applied the targeted cryotherapy on your body, once it's below 12 degrees, for example, well, below 13, the skin's numb. So essentially you're kind of going to switch off to it. So even though it's doing what it needs to be doing, you don't often feel it as much.
No, it's really interesting. I think that taps into the individual approaches that players take, isn't it? And
Yeah.
also their experiences of it before, because like you say,
Yeah.
if they like that shock of an ice bath or whatever it is, they're probably chasing that a lot of the time anyway, aren't they, regardless? You mentioned before about cryotherapy as well, so I think this would be a good time to bring that up, because you see this used obviously a lot with clubs too. So what does the research say in terms of the use of cryotherapy?
So there's two different sides of it. So obviously you've got your whole body cryotherapy, where you're kind of going into the chambers at minus 135 or something ridiculous, freezing. So my research has been more so on the local side, so the local cryotherapy, where you're applying cold in a targeted manner. But yeah, from a player perspective, I've been in those chambers and they are cold. I think my eyebrows went white. So so you definitely feel like something's going on, and you feel energized after it. But yeah, my research has been more so on the local applications of cryotherapy and applying that cold in a targeted manner. Yeah.
No, that's cool. So anyone that's using this with players, what would you say are some really key things they need to be aware of then?
Yeah, so in terms of protocols as well, it's quite an interesting one in terms of we've started to chip away at the evidence base and obviously create evidence-based protocols for different areas. It's such a big area though to cover. Eventually we want to be able to help practitioners by saying, you know, for example, if someone's got an MCL, you can sort of type in their injury characteristics and their personal characteristics, and it kind of spit out, this is the protocol to use, sort of thing. That's obviously further down the line, and hopefully we get there. It's going to have a lot of work put into that, but that's obviously the ultimate goal, is to have some software to make it easy, because we're very conscious that working in elite sport, time is precious and marginal gains are massive. So at the moment we've got default programs set in the device. So the cold default program is 6 degrees. That's the lowest it would go. So holding skin temperature below 6 is when skin burns would start to occur. So it's all within safety parameters. And what's interesting between the actual temperature from the cooling side, the literature talks about an ideal therapeutic range between 10 and 15 degrees of skin surface temperature. So that's to get all the physiological effects that you want from cooling. But I actually think that might evolve in the future. I think it might move between 6 and 12 is my feeling. So 6 and below 13 is when you're going to start to become numb really and get that analgesic effect. So what I found from my results is between 13 and 15, you don't really get the same benefit as below. And then before technology sort of advanced, it's been quite difficult to maintain and control temperature below 10, which is why I think that kind of 10 to 15 kind of came about. But yeah, I do think it could move. Now technology's allowing it to. I think between 6 and 12 is going to become optimal from the research that I've read. Which is obviously good for technology that can control it in that manner and control that way. Again, sorry, I've gone off topic slightly.
No, it's all good. I wanted to flick onto the player side now as well, and just in terms of all this research that you've done and doing, how's that informed your approach personally as a player as well?
Yeah, so obviously working full time and then having football commitments as well, and previously having PhD commitments outside of work, I was probably admit to being lazy with recovery. I'll be honest. I mean, I know what I should be doing. Whether I'm more so if there's a I need to be more disciplined with it. But if there's a big game or I feel a niggle, I will really focus on using the device and cooling. Recovery is where I really need to get into my head a little bit more. I'm not too bad at stretches. And using obviously the contrast setting on our device, quite lucky to be working where I am and have access to those. But yeah, I probably, in terms of nutrition, things like that. I definitely need to focus more on recovery. But yeah, injury management I take very seriously, but I think I'm quite a lazy player when it comes to recovery, which I shouldn't be admitting.
Is that not a lesson in itself, though, for working with players? Because like you say, you've got the knowledge of this area and you obviously understand it more than a lot of people, but the fact of actually getting it done is still a challenge. So when we're working with players, that's going to be a big part of it, isn't it?
Definitely. I think time comes into it. You know, what being professional, I would obviously have more time to do recovery, whereas I'm sort of coming from work, going straight to training and then getting in at 10:30. And the last thing I want to be doing is a lot of recovery stuff before I'm getting up the next day. So I think time is a limitation for me personally, but absolutely, that has been a big part of the developments we've done. So my role at the moment, kind of developing the research and development, is to make it as easy as possible. So actually, Wayne Rooney is a long-term investor in the product, and his one brief was keep it simple. He's very focused on keep it simple because, you know, time for players. And it's really easy to kind of switch off if something's too complicated as well, because just the nature of us as humans. But it has been a massive learning curve in terms of that. Even developing new wraps and things like that, just making it quick and easy, because often it's either going to be at the side of a pitch or you're going to have a busy physio's going to have a busy treatment room to kind of get through. So yeah, quick and easy as possible is real. We've actually recently won another knowledge transfer partnership, and that's to develop the software side. So at the moment, the device has got a really basic app, but it's kind of spits out sort of what protocol has been ran and a bit of a history log. So physios can use it in medical records, for example, if they've sent a player home with it and, you know, set them rehab to do. But what we want to do is to have an automated dashboard where it really helps physios understand what protocols have been effective, on what player, the characteristics of the player and the injury, and really make it as simple as possible and kind of take that headache and a lot of the manual work out of analysing data like this. Because that's probably what's contributing to such the gap in knowledge, is the time to do it for a lot of these practitioners.
Obviously, without naming names, you've been around a lot of teammates. And I'm sure a lot of teammates have a lot of different routines and views on this area as well. We just said there about the challenge with players, that it needs to be simple, it needs to be quick, it needs to be easy. But what are some of the lessons that you've seen from seeing teammates in terms of their routines and making a change?
Yeah, I think footballers are inherently creatures of habit. So I think some sort of, you know, incentive is normally what would get them going, which is often normally an injury, sadly, is when they actually become familiar with more so doing recovery and getting that grained in. I do have one friend that's brilliant and would do everything to an absolute T, and puts me to shame a little bit, but she actually had a long-term injury, and I think that kind of changes mentality, whereas I'll touch wood right now, but I've been fortunate enough not to. So I think it is mentality a lot in players and prolonging that career as well. For me, football is a hobby, and it's a great hobby, but being the age that I am now, I know we spoke before the podcast, and I was saying I wish I'd kind of come into women's football now, because it's so exciting, whereas I'm coming towards the tailor end, we will say. So yeah, I think coming into the game now, you can view it as a career, and that's fantastic. I think that changes mentality as well, because yeah, for me, it's kind of squeezing in and around the work that I currently do. And I've been fortunate enough to play at a decent level and really enjoyed the professionalism in the game. But I think, yeah, mentality wise, it hasn't ever been a career option for me. So I think there is that shift in thought of, like, your body is actually, you know, your career. So I need to take it more seriously. I will be honest with you on here, but yeah, I think the players coming in now have really got of view that that is your tool, and that is what you really need to look after to prolong your career, especially in the women's game where the money isn't the same as the men's kind of set them up for life, shall we say. The longer the game, the longer the career in women's football, you know, it's massive. To then actually get a post career in sport as well, maybe in the media side, if you've been in around the game a long time.
How do we go about that education, do you think, in terms of getting players to prioritize it? Because it's all well and good us having this conversation, or even you having those conversations with teammates. But how do you think we can really get it to sink in for players?
I think the women's players that I've experienced anyway are really open to kind of learning about different pieces. I know at Burnley, I'm quite new to Stockport, so I haven't quite yet, but presentations where people come in and kind of deliver a session are normally received really well. Even little handouts are great that we've had, you know, for example, nutrition, sleep, rest, things like that. And they normally are quick and easy again. But yeah, it's so important. But I do think it is going the right way in terms of talking about it in the media as well. So obviously the ACL saga that's kind of going on at the moment, that's kind of flagging things up to the women's game in terms of it's almost creating a bit of a fear. But that fear might be the change that we need to kind of take it seriously in terms of recovery and rehab for the female athlete.
I think you're right with that. You see it all the time, don't you, when players have an injury, and it's a shame because you'd like to think the change could be made beforehand.
Yeah.
But the injury, especially bigger injuries like you just mentioned there, it can be very impactful on careers, and also it just sort of switches mindsets, doesn't it? And it seems to change people's views on things. So no, I think that's really important, isn't it, for players?
Definitely. And I do think the more we are talking about this ACL injury situation we've got at the moment, I think that's really resonating with players without them having to be injured, because they're seeing, you know, England captain, and then star players, you know, keep picking up these injuries. It is hitting home. I do feel that among the sports. So that might have a positive impact on education. You know, it has a lot of sad implications as well for the girls that are injured. But I do think it is helping with the education piece as well, of kind of raising the awareness of the importance of looking after your body. Not that those injuries could have been helped. Obviously, we need to know a lot more about that. But yeah, I do think it is kind of promoting that in the right direction, at least.
It's, again, we spoke about this before we came on, but they're all the 1%ers, aren't they? Because if we start lining all those up, it's actually very impactful. And we spoke about sort of equipment and everything falling in place for the women's game in terms of allowing them to thrive, facilities, pitches, pitch availability, which is crazy that some teams can't even get pitches available and all the rest of it. These are battles that they've got to face. But if we line it all up, all these little 1%ers, it's a big difference, isn't it?
Definitely. And I know from my playing career, you can go from training on AstroTurf 3G to then going to a game on a nice pitch, to then going to a midweek game on like a cow field. So it can really vary the surfaces. And I think in the men's game, it's a lot more consistent, particularly obviously in the professional elite side. They would train on grass, they would play on grass. It would all be great surfaces to be working with. Whereas having to adjust from the impact of 3G to then a hard grass pitch to then a soft grass pitch, it can vary so much. And I do think it really impacts how you feel the next day. And certainly playing on heavy grass pitches is a real challenge to then going to train. I know it's affected my Achilles previously, kind of chopping and changing surfaces, where I now wear insoles in my boots. So yeah, it definitely has an impact in terms of that variability in terms of standards.
Yeah, definitely. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? I don't like to always compare, but in comparison to the men's game that I've got more, it's more predictable, isn't it? They're playing, especially in the top leagues, they're playing on good pitches, they're training on good pitches, it's staying pretty standard. Whereas like you say, if it is going to be up and down, you don't know what you're going into, it's a lot harder on the body, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think the women's game progressing now, where obviously the elite sides will be at the training grounds that the men are at, and you know, training on great surfaces. So that's going in the right way. But I think there's definitely a bridge between sort of the semi-professional level of getting to that professional level, but there's a lot of variability in terms of what clubs have financially and facilities, and how that then impacts actually the player safety as well at the end of the day, because yeah, all this kind of leads into creating an environment for the injury to happen.
100%. I just want to finally just get your perspective on future areas of research, maybe on a couple of points on here as well, in terms of everything that we've spoken around sort of cooling on that side, but then also on the women's game as well. Do you feel like there's anywhere that sort of stands out that we really need to dive into?
Yeah, so firstly with the cooling, I think I touched on it before in terms of ideal therapeutic range. I do think that has got the ability to move lower down. So it's at the moment it's between 10 and 15. I think it'll move between 6 and 12, given, you know, the right rationale. And for me personally, in terms of the cooling device, I want to look at how deep it's actually going in terms of tissue depth. So that's sort of my next area that I really want to look at, because given that it's an electronic device that's kind of drawing energy out of the body, without boring you too much on physics, it's drawing the energy out, and it's constantly doing that because it's battery powered, whereas water-based products might, once the phase change has happened and it's gone from the ice to the water, there'll be an equilibrium as such between the skin and the temperature of the wrap. So yeah, I'd be really interested to see over a slightly longer treatment of maybe 25 to 30 minutes, how deep that cooling would go, considering that the energy is kind of constantly being extracted rather than kind of reaching that equilibrium state. So yeah, I do want to look at that. That would be interesting. In terms of contrast therapy as well, there's so much to look at. Yeah, that it is a massive gap in knowledge, which is given me a headache. I think when we when we first started the PhD, sat down in my first supervisory meeting, and one of the first early questions was, so how many combinations of time, temperature and compression can the device do? And then we worked it out in a quick algorithm, and it was like 80,000. And we all looked at each other like, we're going to need a strong coffee. Like, where do we go from here? So that's how big the gap is. Yeah, it's a massive gap. Obviously, the goal at the end of it would be to be able to personalize cryotherapy protocols for individuals. So thermal stress is affected by a lot of factors. So gender, age, skin type, BMI, to name a few. So to have something to kind of soak up the person as such and how they would respond to thermal stress, and then actually incorporate their injury as well and the characteristics. There's a lot to go into that, but if something could then kind of advise an evidence-based protocol that they could use to then actually tailor these protocols, it'd be massive. Because in elite sport, even getting back on the pitch 3 days earlier, you know, the financial implications for the club are massive, and that player's mental health and getting back into training and the team performance, there's so many benefits to even reducing that recovery time slightly. So yeah, so that is obviously the ultimate aim on the cooling side. In terms of the football side, I'm really pleased to kind of see the increase from the football women's football research coming up. When I did my dissertation in 2016 at university, it was on the impact of women's players wearing male boots, and it's really great to kind of see that topic now coming up in BBC. So I used to work in a running shop, and I always spoke about this briefly before, and the customer would come in and you would do a gait analysis and kind of match that customer to the exact shoe that they needed in terms of support and obviously gender, the foot shape. So for me to then go online and shopping and go under male football boots and put that in my basket. It just seems so way off compared to the running side. So I knew that area really needed development, and for women's players to be wearing men's boots for so long now, it does seem daft in a way. So we've got all this technology. So it's great to see that sort of progressing. And in terms of the research, it is going in the right way. Obviously, a lot of the research out there is around the male athlete anyway. So I know more research is coming out, but we really need to kind of understand female physiology, particularly in women's football. And we are chipping away at it. But I think that will then lead to an improvement in equipment and technology that we can offer, because we can tailor the needs that we now know. I think at the moment there's a lot of unknowns, which makes it difficult to kind of progress quickly. So it's not going to be a quick win, but I do think it's heading in the right direction. And any sort of equipment that it could be tailored for the women's game is going to be massive. So starting with football boots, we'll start with that.
Brilliant. That's superb. Olivia, just wrap us up. Just give us contacts. So in terms of for yourself to keep an eye on what you've got going on, but also the stuff at Swellaway as well. Is there anywhere that you direct people?
So remember my Twitter. I think it is Liv Greenhalgh on Twitter. I'm sure you'll tag me in it. I'll send you after. And then our managing director at Swellaway is called Jonathan Smith. So add us both on LinkedIn as well. We're quite active on there. So I'm sure you'll find us on there.
Brilliant. Well, I really appreciate you coming on. So thanks a lot for your time.
Oh, it's been great. Thank you, Ben. Thanks for having me.